The morning light over Johannesburg felt strangely heavy. You could hear the low rumble of helicopters drifting above the city, the steady hum of security convoys rolling across the avenues, and the quiet anticipation of thousands of ordinary South Africans standing behind metal barricades, waiting to witness history. For the first time ever, the G20 summit was being hosted on African soil. Mothers held their children higher to catch a glimpse of the passing motorcades. Retired miners, teachers, and shopkeepers stood shoulder to shoulder whispering to one another, "This is our moment. Africa is finally on the world stage." But amid the excitement, something felt off. A single flagpole stood bare, its absence louder than any siren. The United States, one of the most powerful nations in the world, had simply chosen not to come. No last-minute delay, no security excuse, no diplomatic explanation. Just absence. And the message carried by that absence echoed across the square. They were angry. Within hours, reporters confirmed what many feared. Senior officials from Washington had mocked the summit, calling it G100. Too many guests, too crowded, too messy. Words meant to humiliate. Words meant to shrink a moment that Africans had waited more than a century to experience. And standing before the world, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, calm, unshaken, offered a response that cut through the noise. It cannot be that geography or wealth decides who deserves a voice. No nation should bully another. We are all equal. And that is where our story begins. Because this wasn't just a diplomatic snub, it was the visible crack in a global order built long before most of us were born. A fault line stretching from Berlin in 1884, all the way to Johannesburg in 2025. The question now is simple yet profound. Did the United States skip this summit because the world is changing faster than it can accept? And did South Africa just open the door to a new era where Africa finally sets the terms? If you believe the truth matters more than the headlines, stay with us, because what happened next could reshape global power for decades. The first sign that something unusual was unfolding came not from the diplomats or the news anchors, but from the people standing outside the Sandton Convention Center. Elderly women wrapped in patterned shawls, young vendors selling bottled water, taxi drivers waiting in long lines, they all noticed it at the same moment. The convoy that was supposed to carry the U.S. delegation never appeared. The sirens faded into silence, and the empty roadway told a story long before the headlines did. Inside the venue, delegates from across Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America took their seats beneath banners celebrating the first G20 summit ever hosted on African soil. The significance of that moment was not lost on anyone. For South Africa, this wasn't just another diplomatic gathering. It was a symbolic correction to more than a century of exclusion. You could almost feel the weight of history pressing against the glass walls of the conference hall. President Cyril Ramaphosa had been preparing for this for months. His team had insisted that this G20 would not simply follow the usual script written by wealthier nations. They wanted to reshape the event into something more inclusive, more reflective of the real world, where 1.4 billion Africans live, work, struggle, and hope. That is why South Africa made a controversial decision. Instead of hosting only the 20 members, they invited 42 additional countries and organizations, many of which had never been given a voice at meetings of this magnitude. For many African leaders, receiving that invitation felt like a long-awaited acknowledgement. Small island nations facing rising seas, landlocked countries battling crushing debt, and emerging economies seeking fair access to global markets, all were finally being treated as part of the global conversation, not as spectators. In the hallways, you could see ministers shaking hands, exchanging ideas, taking photos, visibly moved to be included. But this very inclusivity was what triggered the political shockwave. In Washington, senior officials from the Trump administration saw South Africa's expanded guest list not as a bold act of global cooperation, but as a direct challenge to the traditional balance of power. A G20 with 42 new voices was in their eyes, a G20 that the United States could no longer dominate, and so instead of engaging, they dismissed the summit as G100 too big, too messy, too unpredictable. It wasn't just criticism, it was ridicule. As news broke that the United States would downgrade its participation, conversations inside the summit shifted. Some diplomats wondered whether this was merely a diplomatic miscalculation. Others saw something deeper. Perhaps Washington feared that the world it built was beginning to evolve beyond its control. European delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Representatives from the African Union whispered among themselves about what this might mean for future negotiations. For the Global South leaders present, it felt like confirmation that their push for recognition was hitting a nerve. Then came the most decisive moment of the day. Standing at the main podium with thousands watching live, President Ramaphosa addressed the controversy directly. His voice was calm but resolute, the kind of voice older Americans would recognize from leaders who spoke during civil rights marches or wartime broadcasts. It cannot be, he said slowly, that geography or wealth decides whose voice matters. It cannot be that one nation speaks down to another. We are all equal. The hall erupted in applause, long-sustained, emotional. Delegates stood on their feet. Some wiped away tears. For many African representatives, these were words they had waited decades to hear spoken on a world stage. Outside, the people who had been watching the screens nodded in agreement. A retired schoolteacher said softly, "He's speaking for all of us." A man who once worked in the mines added, "Finally, someone is not afraid to say it." In that instant, the G20 summit transformed. It was no longer about who attended or who didn't. It became a defining moment, an assertion that Africa would no longer remain politely silent on the edges of global power. Long before global news channels began broadcasting the controversy, the tension could already be felt on the streets outside the summit. A group of university students stood clustered around a portable radio, the signal crackling as commentators debated whether the United States would reverse its decision and send a senior representative. A grandmother selling roasted mealies turned the volume up, muttering, "They won't come. They don't want to share the stage." The people sensed the storm building even before the diplomats did. Inside the halls of the G20, the mood shifted rapidly. Delegates from smaller nations, those who had just experienced their first invitation to a global economic forum, began whispering anxiously among themselves. What did this American absence mean? Was it a protest, a warning, or worse, an ultimatum? And why now, when Africa was finally being included in shaping global priorities? The answer became clearer within hours. Reporters confirmed that senior U.S. officials had not only rejected the expanded guest list, but had mocked it. G100, they said, laughing to themselves. Too many seats, too many voices, too many non-Western perspectives. The message behind their words was unmistakable. Global governance should remain exclusive, predictable, and controlled, preferably by the same few players who had always set the rules. This was the spark that pushed the summit into its most dramatic moment. President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped onto the stage again, not out of ceremony, but out of necessity. He adjusted the microphone, paused, and let the silence hang. It felt like the kind of silence Americans over 60 may remember from moments when leaders addressed a nation in crisis, measured heavy, unignorable. Then he spoke not with anger, but with a clarity that cut through every distraction. It cannot be, he began, that the legitimacy of this gathering depends on who chooses to bless it with their presence. It cannot be that one nation decides who deserves a voice at the table. No country should decide for another. We are all equal. This was the climax, the moment the room froze. European delegates shifted uneasily. Some nodded slowly, knowing the critique was not aimed solely at Washington. Representatives from small African and Pacific nations sat stunned, hearing in Ramaphosa's voice an echo of decades of quiet frustration finally breaking free. The African Union delegation exchanged glances of pride. For the first time, their institution held a permanent G20 seat, and the world was seeing why it mattered. The reaction outside the hall was just as powerful. In a nearby cafe, patrons stopped eating as the speech was replayed on the screen. A taxi driver whispered, "This is what they fear, that we will stop asking for permission." A young mother carrying her baby nodded, saying, "At least someone is standing up for us." But not everyone was moved. Within an hour, U.S. officials responded from Washington, insisting that they were streamlining the G20 and returning it to its core purpose. They argued that too many voices would make the forum inefficient, unmanageable, or, using a word that struck many Africans, a circus. The implication was clear: an international gathering becomes disorderly only when countries from the Global South join the conversation. This triggered a second wave of reactions. Brazilian officials criticized the U.S. stance as outdated. Indian diplomats quietly remarked that Washington was resisting the reality of a multipolar world. Chinese representatives, never missing an opportunity, emphasized that global governance should reflect fairness and represent the developing world. Yet, the most significant response came from African civil society groups who loudly defended South Africa's leadership and denounced Western double standards. Across social media, the debate exploded. Was South Africa being brave or reckless? Was the United States defending order or protecting privilege? And was this truly about efficiency or fear? Those watching closely understood the deeper truth. The U.S. reaction wasn't about the guest list at all. It was about the fear of losing the ability to define legitimacy itself. Because when 42 new voices joined the conversation, voices long ignored or dismissed the ground beneath the old power's shifts, and for the first time the world was watching that shift in real time. The morning after the U.S. absence became global news, everyday South Africans felt the impact more deeply than any diplomatic cable might suggest. In a quiet township outside Johannesburg, a group of elders gathered at a community center where the radio crackled nonstop with commentary about the summit. Some were confused, others were frustrated. All of them were asking the same question. If our voices don't matter now, when will they ever matter? For many citizens, the G20 was never about prestige or ceremony. It was about survival, about debts that suffocate small economies, about climate disasters that destroy villages, about minerals extracted from African soil while African families remain poor. When the United States mocked the expanded guest list, many ordinary people interpreted it as a dismissal of their struggles. A grandmother who survived the 1980s apartheid protests said softly, "We fought so hard to be heard. Now, they tell us there are too many of us at the table." This emotional wound fed directly into the larger political consequences. In the days that followed, analysts noticed a dramatic shift in African public opinion toward global institutions. Confidence in the G20, IMF, and World Bank, already fragile, declined further. People began to question whether these systems were ever meant to include them in the first place. If a summit meant to represent the global economy rejected broader participation, what did that say about fairness? For older Africans, the moment felt painfully familiar. It reminded them of Berlin 1884, of colonial borders drawn without consent of the United Nations Security Council with no African permanent seat. Politicians across the continent seized on this sentiment, arguing that Africa needed to take its destiny into its own hands rather than waiting for validation from Western powers. Civil society groups, environmental activists, debt justice coalitions, youth networks mobilized almost overnight. They released statements condemning Washington's stance and praising South Africa for its courage. In cities across the continent, small demonstrations emerged not against America itself, but against the idea that only a handful of countries should decide the world's direction. These activists framed the U.S. absence not as a diplomatic disagreement, but as a symbol of a deeper injustice, the refusal to acknowledge the lived realities of billions of people in the global South. A young climate organizer said during a TV interview, "If they fear our voices, it means our voices are finally powerful." Within African governments, the incident acted like a catalyst. Countries that had previously been cautious about challenging the West now began openly discussing alternatives. Stronger regional trade blocs, expanded BRICS cooperation, and increased alignment with the African Union's agenda. Diplomats privately admitted that Washington's reaction had unintentionally strengthened Africa's resolve to act collectively. Even leaders who had long relied on Western aid started questioning whether these partnerships were truly respectful. The idea that Africa should negotiate as a united front, not as 55 fragmented states, gained extraordinary momentum. Perhaps the most significant political consequence was psychological, the realization that Africa no longer needed permission to demand a seat at the table. The AU's newfound status as a G20 permanent member became more than symbolic, it became a rallying point. For the first time, African leaders were speaking openly about shaping the global agenda rather than merely reacting to it. They understood that if Africa coordinated its position on climate finance, debt restructuring, and critical minerals, it could no longer be ignored. And across Johannesburg, from the cafes to the markets, one sentiment echoed again and again. If they don't want us at their table, maybe it's time we build our own. At a small diner outside Washington, D.C., a group of retired veterans sat around a table sipping their morning coffee as the G20 headlines flashed across the mounted television. One of them, a former naval officer, leaned back and muttered, "We skipped the summit. That's not strategy. That's insecurity." His comment captured something few in the political class openly acknowledged that the world America helped build is now changing, and the United States is struggling to decide how to respond. Because from the American perspective, the expanded G20 wasn't just a South African experiment. It was a glimpse of a future where Washington no longer holds the uncontested influence it once did. Senior U.S. officials worried that 42 new voices, many from the Global South, would band together and challenge Western priorities on debt, climate finance, critical minerals, and trade. And they weren't wrong. Those voices were aligning not chaotically but systematically. To many policymakers in Washington, the concern wasn't the numbers, it was the direction. A larger G20 meant more states questioning U.S. financial dominance, more countries pushing back against the dollar-backed lending system, and more pressure on Western corporations benefiting from Africa's raw materials. The fear wasn't about disorder. It was about losing the ability to set the terms. This is why American officials framed their objections as concerns about efficiency and focus. But beneath those phrases was a deeper anxiety. A multipolar world leaves no room for a single referee. Older Americans watching this play out recognized echoes of history: the end of British dominance after World War II, the rise of Japan in the 1980s, the ascension of China in the 2000s. Each shift came with resistance. But this one was different. This time, entire continents, Africa, Latin America, South Asia, were asserting themselves simultaneously. European leaders publicly tried to remain diplomatic, but behind closed doors, many were concerned for different reasons. Europe depends heavily on African minerals, African migration routes, and African partnerships for energy transitions. If the African Union began negotiating as a united bloc within the G20, Europe's leverage could shrink drastically. Countries like France and the UK, whose imperial history still casts a shadow, worried that expanded African influence might reopen uncomfortable debates about colonial debts, mineral agreements, and military presence. Germany, for its part, feared the economic implications: higher prices, tougher negotiations, and less access to cheap resources. Meanwhile, India, Brazil, China, and Russia saw South Africa's bold move as a strategic gift. For them, a larger G20 meant more partners to challenge Western-controlled institutions, more support for new development banks, more votes in international forums, and more leverage over global trade routes. BRICS members immediately recognized that the U.S. absence wasn't a sign of strength, it was a sign of discomfort. For countries long sidelined, this was proof that the power balance was finally shifting in their favor. Across the world, commentators noted that the Johannesburg summit exposed a structural truth: the old world order is no longer sustainable. A system designed in 1945 cannot govern a planet where Africa alone will soon represent 25% of humanity. Whether the U.S. embraces or resists this change will determine the stability of the next decades. But for now, the world has seen something that cannot be unseen. When Africa widens the table, the balance of power tilts no matter who boycotts the meeting. As the lights dimmed in the Sandton Convention Center and the final session of the Johannesburg G20 came to an end, a strange stillness settled over the city. Delegates boarded their planes. Security barricades were dismantled. Cafes that had been overflowing with journalists slowly grew quiet again. But something in the air had changed, something you could feel, even if you couldn't quite name it. Across Africa, people sensed it too. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Accra to Addis Ababa. There was a growing belief that the old rules of global power no longer held the weight they once did. And for millions watching from their living rooms, especially the older generation who lived through colonialism, the Cold War, and the early struggles of independence, this moment carried a deeper meaning. It felt like the beginning of a long-awaited shift. But with that shift came a warning. Because if there is one truth history teaches us, it is this: when old powers feel threatened, they rarely step aside quietly. If the United States, Europe, and other established actors continue to treat inclusive multilateralism as a threat rather than an evolution, then the world is heading toward a period of turbulence. Not necessarily war, but instability, competing trade blocs, fractured diplomacy, and economic pressures that could redraw alliances for a generation. And this is where the story widens far beyond Johannesburg. Across the continent, leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore are already embracing a new kind of political imagination, one built on sovereignty, dignity, and refusing to accept a world where Africa is forever an invited guest rather than a co-author. You see his influence not only in military reforms or economic decisions, but in the way young Africans speak about themselves, in the way diaspora communities return home with hope, in the way Africa news has become less about crisis and more about transformation. What happened at the G20 wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a continental awakening, a message that Africa will no longer whisper its needs or negotiate from the margins. Whether it is climate justice, debt restructuring, mineral wealth, or political representation, the era of asking politely is ending. The era of stating terms has begun. The real question now is not whether the world heard Africa's message, but whether it is prepared to accept what comes next. And so I ask you, especially those of you who have watched global power rise, fall, and rise again over the decades, was this G20 summit the beginning of a new global order? Or was it merely a glimpse, a signal of a future still fighting to be born? Your thoughts matter. Your experience matters. Leave a comment below and tell us what you believe this moment means for Africa and for the world your children and grandchildren will inherit. And if you feel that you are among the first to truly understand this shift, please share this video. If you believe the truth is always more important than the headlines, subscribe and stay with us. This is only one chapter in a story much bigger, and Africa is just getting started.